Hello, my name is Alexa Pearson. I'm the Director of Standards and Instructional Support at the Oregon Department of Education. And I'm joined on this webinar today by my colleagues Dan Farley, ODE's Director of Assessment, and Ken Greenbaum, Director of Digital Learning. This webinar was adapted from a presentation that we did at the January 2021 Winter Conference of the Coalition of Oregon School Administrators. We geared this presentation toward educational leaders who want to examine their grading practices, whether that be at the classroom level, building level, or district level. So this is going to age me. I started my teaching career over 20 years ago, and I still remember that first year after teaching that I knew that I had to change my grading practices. And I spent so much time that first year figuring out how many points something was worth. Kids were asking me how much points were worth, how many assignments were worth, extra credit, all those kind of things were just swirling. And I really didn't have a lot in my preparation to think about how I was going to calculate grades equitably. So I started conversations with other teachers and continued those conversations throughout my career as an instructional coach, as a building administrator, and as a district administrator. And here I am at ODE having these conversations again. So for me, and I think for a lot of you, it feels a little bit like Groundhog's Day. I was an English teacher, so I often think of metaphors, but I think about this groundhog because I keep thinking, okay, are we still talking about late work? When are we going to really shift this conversation? I also understand why this conversation is so difficult. So if you ever have had the other metaphor or analogy here that I'll use, the picture is the hornet's nest. Because if you have ever had conversations about grading, whether that be with teachers, with parents, with students, it can feel like it's a hornet's nest. And our educational system is entrenched in traditional grading practices, and any changes that disrupt that system is probably going to come with some stings. So for today's discussion, we're framing as a high-level overview. We based a lot of this on Grading for Equity by Joe Feldman. And this will not be a deep dive, but we want to draw upon some of the wisdom within this book that we read and a couple other places that we've been drawing information from. And much of what like I said, much of this was a seminal resource that we did use. So Ken and Dan are going to discuss the importance of grading, why it matters, and what we've learned in the past century about our grading practices.
Thanks, Alexa. So we want to center equity in our discussion today. And so I'm going to read this quote from the School Reform Initiative. Schools are a major part of society's institutional processes for maintaining a relatively stable system of inequality. They contribute to these results by active acceptance and utilization of a dominant set of values, norms, and beliefs, which, while appearing to offer opportunities to all, actually support the success of a privileged minority and hinder the efforts and visions of a majority. And so as we continue today, it's important that we acknowledge throughout this discussion that many of these current grading practices are part of this dominant set of values, norms, and beliefs. And our values, norms, and beliefs influence our grading practices, and those can in turn either contribute to or dismantle inequitable systems. Dan's going to talk a bit about the history and current status of research around equitable grading.
Thanks, Ken, for that framing. The research on grading over the past century tells us that our grading practices are generally inconsistent. Another way of saying that is not reliable. In many cases, our practices are not even mathematically defensible. There are different sources of variance or deviations from a typical practice within teacher grading approaches that include differences in the criteria that are used to evaluate student work, the quality of student work, teacher severity or leniency in grading, of course, differences in the tasks that students are asked to complete, as well as the grading scales that are used. And in addition to that, there are oftentimes can be found teacher error. This series of studies actually point to three sources for solutions. So it's not all gloom and doom. There are actually the research has pointed to three practices that can help interfere or disrupt inequitable grading practices. So the three solutions that are pointed to by the research, as summarized by Guskey and Brookhart, are to use really clear criteria in terms of assignments and scoring, to take steps to ensure consistency. So that can be consistency across teachers, consistency across assignments within a classroom. There are multiple ways in which that can be framed. We also want to make sure that we don't use scales that require finer distinctions that we can accurately make. For example, a 100-point scale from 0 to 100 has 101 gradations for achievement. It's highly unlikely that we can develop a single assignment that is actually reliable enough and accurate enough to just differentiate between students at a 92 versus a 93, for example. So we also know that when student performance is poorly measured, the decisions based upon those data are not appropriate. The research is also clear that not adhering to equitable grading practices allows biases to show up in teacher grading, including biases related to race, ethnicity, gender, and culture. I'm going to turn the reins back over to Alexa now, who will lead us through a couple of reflection discussion activities.
All right. Well, since grading is about assessment, one of the first assessment pieces is for you to think about just what's your appetite? Where are you now for these discussions? So are you at a place of the, Groundhog's Day? You've done this, you don't want to touch it again. Are you ready to dive in a little bit, learn a little bit about the hornets? Are you ready to poke the nest? Or are you really ready for some removal, some hornet nest removal, which will take some time and some research and study? So I think starting this conversation, when we did this as a presentation with COSA, we did this as a Mentimeter. So we had this as a participant piece. So if you want to take a moment to pause and to reflect on and discuss this question, please go ahead and pause the webinar now. And then I will go ahead and turn it over to Dan, who's going to present a foundational question for discussions related to implementing more equitable grading practices.
Thanks, Alexa. So according to Susan Brookhart, who's one of the seminal researchers in grading practices, the first question to address as education teams should be, what do grades convey about educational beliefs? It's really important to develop shared understandings of grades, of what grades should and should not signify to help guide equitable grading practice implementation thereafter. There has to be a shared systems level understanding of what grading means before progress in this space can be made. So yet again, if you are wanting to use this time to reflect individually or to have a small group or group discussion, you can pause the webinar. With that, we will turn it over to Ken.
Thanks, Dan. So now that we have some framing, our learning objectives for today are to identify at least one next step that may impact district or school in equitable grading practices, and then also be able to locate relevant resources. Shown here is one of those resources Dan referenced earlier, What We Know About Grading by Guskey and Brookhart. It's another great resource from which we pull. So Dan is going to now talk about some of ODE's guidance regarding grading.
So ODE developed guidance on addressing grades and credit options for district consideration in response to concerns that were shared with us about increased failure rates, particularly in the early grades in high school, but also for some seniors who are inching their way toward graduation during a pandemic. The resource includes 4 actions that districts can take, which Alexa will discuss with you all in a little bit. Oregon's credit options, which provide high schools with some ways to meet the needs of students who have not yet been able to meet graduation requirements in conventional ways, can pursue to meet via Oregon's credit options. Those are established in OAR in Oregon, and they include evidence of student learning collected through courses, evidence from summative assessments, evidence from student-created collections of evidence that are scored against rubrics, and evidence of student learning that's provided through documentation of prior mastery, such as certification of training, letters, diplomas, etc. So Joe Feldman's work is really seminal to this effort, and he outlines 3 pillars of grading that we want to draw to your attention. The first is accuracy, the second is bias resistant, and the third is motivation. So accuracy, according to Feldman, involves our grading must having to use calculations that are mathematically sound, easy to understand, and correctly describe a student's level of academic performance. In order to be bias resistant, grades should be based on valid evidence of students' content knowledge and not based on evidence that is likely to be corrupted by a teacher's implicit bias or reflect a student's environment. In terms of motivation, the way we grade should motivate students to achieve academic success, support a growth mindset, and give students opportunities for redemption. There are many things that I learned about grading the hard way as a teacher, similarly to Alexa. I know that my grading practices interfered in some cases with student motivation, as they had dug a hole that was so deep they did not feel that they could dig out. Let's not allow those practices to continue. As I digested Joe Feldman's book, Grading for Equity, I cobbled these tenets together, going across all 3 pillars of equitable grading. The first bullet is one that I inserted, and Joe is not to be blamed for, but I believe it to be important to mention that it's not appropriate to grade students on content that hasn't been provided directly to them by the instructor. This seems to be a foundational premise of fairness. If you can work with your team and come to the conclusion that grades should reflect student mastery of the knowledge and skills conveyed in a particular course, whether academic in nature or based on professional skills, these tenets are in play. We'll focus our discussion on 2 of these tenets that fall within the realm of Feldman's first pillar of accuracy today. That grades must be criterion referenced and mathematically accurate, both in terms of computation and scale. These tenets are most effective when enacted as systems level changes at the district or, dare I say, state level. I'll cover a couple relevant experiences and examples on the next slide. We all have students whom we've served that our grading systems have failed. I recall several students I've had in my career who had so many zeros in my math grade book that they realized they could not catch up and stopped coming to class despite our efforts to reach out to them. Others took a while to get acclimated to a new school, a new language, a new group of teachers, or a new principal, and did not show what they knew and could do until very late in the school year. My son, Dylan, is one example. He didn't decide to be a student until the beginning of his junior year in high school, notably as his classes started to get more challenging and interesting. Did my grading practices give all of my students a viable path to proficiency? The answer is no. Does my son Dylan's high school grade point average reflect his level of proficiency? The answer to that question is also no. I'm going to frame a discussion first around averages, and then Ken is actually going to lead a discussion about minimum grading and zeros hereafter. But I want you to consider the 5 unit scores that the student in this example got here at the bottom. So the student got a 91, 92, a 40, a 94, and a 94. What grade should the student get with those 5 unit scores? So if we're using average, that works out to be an 82.2%, which is a low B. If we use different measures of central tendency like mode or median, with mode, the student would get a 94. With median, the student would get a 92. So it's a really important to consider the measure of central tendency that you're using in your grading practices, and steering away from averages in most cases is relatively defensible. Another thing to consider in this example is what if the 40% ended up being an assignment that wasn't turned in, that was graded as a 0? That would drop this student's score to a 74% or a C. It's questionable whether that is indicative of the student's overall level of skill and mastery in this course. In fact, it's important as well not to compare students to each other either. There's no reason that some students must fail because others have achieved at high levels. I always have used running metaphors with a marathon as the definition of proficiency. it's clear to me that everyone can finish a marathon. And the fact that some people finish the marathon faster than others doesn't necessarily change the marathon as a 26.2-mile race as being an appropriate standard. I remember I ran the Boston Marathon with my father in 1992, and I was really amazed at how many different kinds of people were out there running and finishing the marathon. It was my first marathon, so I was expecting to be surrounded exclusively by lithe, wiry bodies, but there were literally people of all shapes and sizes, all running at different speeds and sometimes unexpected speeds. And those who weren't able to finish that day were able to give it another try later. So that's really important for us to consider with students in our classrooms as well, that everyone has their own kind of path to learning and growth forward. Another key practice to consider in addition to averages is minimum grading and the elimination of zeros, which Ken will discuss next.
Thanks, Dan. So zeros mathematically put students at the bottom of a mountain that seems and may actually be impossible to climb. And setting a minimum grade of 50% reorients the traditional grading scale away from failure and towards a system which allows students to have a chance, especially those students experiencing what is known in the research as intermittent early low performance. So it creates hope. And it's more likely to ensure that students stay motivated, and it preserves the possibility of success. I want to note that this assumes a 0 to 100 point system, which, as Dan alluded to earlier, is itself flawed, with 60% of the possible scores representing failure, as you can see on the slide there. But with this traditional system so common, we wanted to include this as one way of making grading concretely more equitable and more motivating. So as I mentioned, minimum grading specifically supports those students where early low grades put them in a mathematical hole. It minimizes the impact of so-called intermittent early low performance. And which students tend to experience intermittent disruptions to their learning, right? Perhaps students who are taking care of a family member or have unreliable transportation or unreliable internet access. So this is an equitable and motivating strategy which addresses some of those elements. But won't grades be inflated? What about missing assignments and many more important questions? And these are important, but when explored deeper, they lead us to asking other really important, more deep questions, right? What does a grade represent? How does that represent our values? And so on and so forth. And these are really important discussions to have as a staff, as an organization, with any grading policy. I'm going to turn it back to Dan, who will introduce some more examples and non-examples.
Thanks, Ken. I want to briefly remind you of Feldman's 3 pillars because they're going to frame the activity that we were hoping you would complete on the next slide. So the 3 pillars are accuracy, bias resistant, and motivation. We put together a list of grading practices that are equitable and contrasted them with practices that are inequitable in this table. It's helpful to develop understanding to list both examples and non-examples when you're facing new concepts. You'll note that there are several practices that are connected to the 2 tenets that we identified earlier, namely discontinuing the use of averages and avoiding the use of 0 scores. We would ask that you contribute some of your experiences, giving examples of equitable practices and inequitable practices as you go through the discussion that we were setting up. And the discussion involves reviewing each of these examples and non-examples, discussing which pillar or pillars each of them might belong to. So some of these examples will go across all 3 pillars because of their reach. Some are really specific to one. And this will be a good place to pause the webinar for some group discussion to develop kind of shared understanding and schema around Feldman's 3 pillars.
All right. Dan and Ken have reviewed several of these that they've gone through in in deeper detail, but I wanted to make sure that I address the 4 actions that were detailed in ODE's addressing grades and credit options guidance. That was a supplement to the Ready Schools Safe Learners guidance. I just want to be really clear. These 4 actions are not they're not easy. And there's these pictures of the suitcases down there because it'll take a while to unpack. If you've done a lot of professional learning, you've heard that before, the word that phrase of unpacking. And some of these will take longer to unpack than others. So want to make sure folks know that this is not, we do know that these are going to take some time, and they are actions that move toward dismantling inequitable systems. So we do have some districts that are already making, throughout Oregon, that are already making these changes. And so the first one is for that allowing the late work and the retakes and revisions. I think some of the examples that both Dan and Ken provided describe why that differences in learning happen, over time, and that we basically, in order to encourage motivation and improvement, we need to emphasize the learning and not the behavior of turning in late work. Because and I know we get the argument of like, but what about in the real world? I know in the real world, I have asked for extensions. I have talked to my supervisors about extensions on things. So the real world, we can also separate that from grading by reporting that separately in a different place. We also want to develop and apply grading scales that eliminate zeros. Think that, again, it's very, very difficult when you look at the mathematics of when you apply a 0, that it's almost impossible to climb out of that. So there's an example, Ben Lapine has a district policy. We've linked that in our guidance that you could look at. But some of these can be either classroom level, school level, but when they get up to the district level, it really does become more systemic within that system. Using incompletes, this is related to number 2, but using incompletes to reflect insufficient or incomplete evidence and not an F. As you know, during the spring of 2020, we made a statewide decision that no student would earn an F, that there would be incompletes, and that gave students time to be able to figure out a credit assurance plan to work toward completing that unfinished learning. Alternative grading marks, of course, are not a solution on their own, but they can provide increased flexibility and extend the time frame for students to demonstrate their learning. And finally, and one of, I think, just the absolutely most important pieces of this, and it is the one that probably is in the largest suitcase because it's a lot to do, but it's focusing on formative assessment and feedback. And every bit of research that you can see focuses on this piece, that giving a student 1 letter grade every few months does not provide the feedback that they need to know about the next step in their learning. If you think about, of course, there's always sports analogies, but if you have a coach out there who's giving feedback at every practice, we want to see evidence of that in the game. And that feedback is going to look different for every player. Same thing with a dress rehearsal, a music rehearsal, any of those pieces, you would never see the coach or the director or the conductor not giving feedback to the participants all along the way.
So we've given you a lot of information around the 3 pillars, 4 actions, some examples and non-examples. We want to give you a moment to reflect or discuss on some 3 questions moving towards action. So which equitable grading actions have the most traction or presence in your district or school? And what has been the impact? Which might be the hardest to move toward and why? And what districts or schools do you look to as models for equitable grading practices, and how might you engage or learn from them? So take a moment to pause the webinar and reflect or discuss on these questions. So one issue that might have come up for you in your reflection or discussion is the role of technology. And we know that inequitable grading practices have been ubiquitous before the pandemic. So why is this so amplified right now? There are many reasons, but we wanted to share one hypothesis as it relates to technology, as it might inform some next steps. This is just a hunch, and we could, of course, be wrong, but we suspect that this may be one important factor. So technology tools tend to make elements of schooling like completion, participation, and effort very binary and thus augmented in a remote setting. So for example, as a teacher, my camera is never off in a classroom, so to speak. However, in a remote setting, what is front and center for me as a teacher is literally student faces in boxes on or off, right? Or assignments in a learning management system in a counted queue. So this, I think, can really emphasize things like participation and completion and quote unquote effort in a remote space. We know that factors like the role of algorithms, the appearance of scientific measurement, and learning management systems and other software's ability or not to do things like proficiency-based grading can all amplify inequitable grading practices. There are, of course, ways in which technology can help and accelerate equitable grading practices as well. So it might be helpful to think about this influence of technology as you explore our mindsets and moving forward with equitable grading practices, particularly in the moment in which we find ourselves now. As we think about the change management that's often associated with moving towards equitable grading practices at those larger and larger levels of scale, it can sometimes be helpful to have some frameworks in which to do so. And so we're going to share two now that might be helpful to use as you think about moving towards equitable grading practices. This first is the kind of technical versus adaptive framework. So take a moment and just read through each of those elements of technical problems and adaptive challenges. And as you do, it might be helpful to think about what aspects of equitable grading change management, right, are technical, or perhaps which ones involve more learning or more adaptive. And of course, there are probably elements of both as you think about moving forward. So this is just one framework, and Alexa is going to review a second framework, which also might be helpful. Alexa.
Yes, in my leadership, I've often thought about the idea of discourse 1 and discourse 2. This is from chapter 6 of Race, Ethnicity, and Multiculturalism, Policy and Practice, Changing the Discourse in Schools by Eugene Eubanks, Ralph Parrish, and Diane Smith. And one of the things they say is in a discourse 2 school, ambiguity and change are part of a purposeful structure. The direction for change is clear. It is intended to produce schools where every student develops intellectually to high levels and the performance gap related to race, class, and gender narrows until school effects are no longer correlated with those factors. Discourse 2 paths are full of landmines and ambushes. It takes courage, intelligence, guile, determination, sensitivity, patience, caring, and time. And so I want to talk about that because kind of that hornet's nest piece that I shared before, discourse 2 really gets into removing that hornet's nest. You may notice there at that last bullet, it says, you might not have all the answers here, but if you look over there at discourse 1, you might be saying, I don't have the time. When are we going to have time for this? But if you shift over to the discourse 2, it's getting started anyway. That's that last bullet there. But where can you get started anyway and take that first step? And the next slide, there's a couple quotes too that I'll share. The first one is, this was from Bettina Love, and she, again, just relating back, this discourse 2 does not happen. This might be a long thing, time that you just work at this. But, she says that she talks about courageous co-conspirators that will help dismantle systems that have previously privileged some and oppressed others. And she talks about how it's about unlearning the habits and practices that have protected those systems. So think about who are those co-conspirators that you can connect with to help you make those changes. And then also, we also know that grading is part of a much larger system. So it's one component, and that educators must first take time to consider their own biases, how those show up in the classroom, and examine the curriculum that they're teaching, the resources they use, the perspectives they're sharing. In a recent interview with Educational Leadership, Cornelius Minor states, there absolutely is such a thing as anti-racist grading, but it starts with me examining the biases that I bring into school and the discriminatory ideologies and structures that lead to the type of pedagogy I engage in. It's about me disrupting the very curriculum that I teach, and then it gets to the grading. And I love this last part of the quote. Think of grading as the output. If your programming code is bad, the output of the program will always be bad. So again, not a quick fix, going to take time. It's time to start examining these systems.
As we begin to conclude here, we want to also offer some additional resources. Here are some from the Grading for Equity website. If you go there, these are accessible, and they really have some artifacts that begin to give some vision to concretely what equitable grading can look and feel like for teachers and students. There's a letter to parents, which describes many of the elements we talked about today in action, some sample report cards, which are different from those traditional systems, and some other really excellent resources that start to see how this might come to life for teachers and students.
We want to thank you for your engagement and participation. Here you will find a variety of resources that we have found to be helpful, developing an understanding of both the theory and the practical implications of grading research on this slide. Alexa will also share our contact information if you would like to reach out for thought partnership support, or if you have questions, comments, or recommendations to share.
All right, well, thank you, everybody. This is our contact. Let us be those co-conspirators with you to help change systems. Please reach out with any questions, concerns, ideas. We hope to continue this conversation, and we appreciate you being here with us today.